Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that's pretty important for anyone who's working in India or thinking about it, or for companies that got operations over there. Employee transfers. We've got this fascinating article here by Pala Kumari, who's a law student. It's a really in-depth look at all the legal stuff surrounding these transfers and how they work.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of people don't really think about until they're actually faced with it. And the laws in India can be pretty different from what people might be used to in other countries.
Absolutely. And one thing that really jumped out at me reading this was that in India, there's no fundamental right for an employee to stay put in one place if their job's transferable.
That's right. The power to transfer employees, that really lies with the employer. And this goes for both government jobs and private companies.
So why is that? Why is this power to transfer such a big deal for employers? It seems like it could be pretty disruptive, having to move around all the time.
Well, you got to think about it from the employer's perspective. They need to be able to move people around to keep things running smoothly, to adapt to new situations, fill in gaps where they need people. And the courts in India, they've generally backed this up. They see it as being essential for, the business to be able to operate efficiently.
It's interesting. The article actually mentions a case, Shilpi Bose, where a group of teachers were transferred and they actually fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's a really important case. Basically, the Supreme Court ended up siding with the employer. And they made it pretty clear that they're not going to interfere with these kinds of administrative decisions unless there's some clear evidence that something's wrong, like if it's done out of malice or it violates specific rules.
So it sounds like the courts are really putting a lot of weight on those operational needs.
Yeah, they are.
But what about the employees' side of things? I mean, it must be tough to just have to pick up and move your whole life, potentially, without having much say in it.
Oh, absolutely. It can be incredibly disruptive. And there are definitely situations where the courts have stepped in, if it can be proven that the transfer was done for like a personal vendetta, or if it clearly violates some kind of regulation. But generally speaking, they try to avoid getting too involved in those day-to-day decisions about how a company manages its people.
So there's a line there, but it sounds like it can be a pretty blurry line sometimes. What about situations where it might not be actually illegal, but it could still feel pretty unfair to the employee? Like if someone keeps getting transferred to worse and worse locations, or they get moved just before some big family event, what can they do in those cases?
Well, that's when things get really interesting, and it kind of highlights why having a clear and transparent transfer policy is absolutely crucial, even if something isn't technically breaking the law. A policy that's poorly written or that's not applied consistently can cause a lot of problems, a lot of frustration for employees, and it can even open the door to legal challenges down the road.
The article talks about this idea of a good transfer policy needing to aim for equitable distribution of employees. What does that actually look like in practice?
So imagine you've got a company, and certain people are constantly being sent off to the locations that nobody really wants to go to, while other employees, they seem to stay put in the best spots, the plum assignments. That wouldn't exactly feel very fair, would it? A good transfer policy, it tries to make sure that the burdens and the benefits of transfers are spread out fairly across the whole workforce.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about avoiding legal trouble. It's about keeping things fair and maintaining good morale within the company. But what happens when an employee has a really compelling reason to not be transferred? Like what if they've got a family member with a serious health condition or something? How much weight do those personal factors really carry?
That's a tough one, and there's no easy answer. The courts have generally said that, yeah, personal difficulties are understandable, but they don't automatically override the employer's right to transfer somebody. There's a case, actually, Rajendra Roy versus Union of India, where the court basically said, hey, look, these personal issues, those are for the employer to weigh, not for the courts to decide.
So it's more of an internal company matter. The company can choose to be compassionate, but they're not legally required to put those personal circumstances above their own needs as an organization.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act for sure. On the one hand, employers need to think about the impact that these decisions have on people's lives. But on the other hand, they also have this responsibility to make sure that the organization as a whole is functioning effectively.
So we've talked about this power dynamic and how important it is to have fair policies in place. But it seems like open communication could also play a really big role here, right? If the employee understands why this transfer is happening, maybe they're more likely to be okay with it, even if it's not the most convenient thing for them.
Oh, absolutely. Communication is huge. Imagine if you were just suddenly told you'd have to move across the country for work, and nobody even bothered to explain why, It
Yeah.
wouldn't feel great. Employers, they really should be upfront about the reasons behind a transfer, how long they expect it to last, what kind of support they're going to provide during the transition. All of that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, being kept in the dark never helps anyone.
Yeah.
So it sounds like employers have a lot to think about here. Clear policies, making sure things are equitable, communicating openly. But what about the employees themselves? How can they make sure that their voice is heard in this whole process?
That's a great question. And it brings us to something that's really important in all of this. Unions.
Right, unions.
Mm.
They can be a really powerful advocate for employees, especially in situations like this. But how do they actually work when it comes to transfers?
Well, let's dig into that. Unions can be a total game changer when it comes to making sure that employees' rights are protected.
Yeah, so when it comes to transfers, unions can really make a huge difference. They can actually negotiate with employers to get clear guidelines written into those transfer policies themselves, and they can be there, speaking up on behalf of their members,
Okay.
even challenge those transfer decisions if they seem unfair or if there's something arbitrary about them.
So it's like having somebody in your corner who can really fight for what's best for you. But how effective are they really? I mean, do employers actually listen to what the unions have to say?
Well, it really depends on a few things,
Yeah.
like how strong the union is in the first place, the industry that they're in, even the specific laws in the region can make a difference.
Right.
But in general, having a strong union presence definitely gives employees more leverage. It makes sure that their concerns are taken seriously by the employer.
Can you give me an example of how a union might step in and actually change things in a real-world scenario? Sure. Let's say a company is thinking about transferring a whole bunch of their employees to a new location, you
Yeah.
know? The union can get involved right away. They can negotiate things like relocation packages. They can push for employees to have a voice in the decision-making process. And they can even challenge the whole transfer altogether if it seems like it's going to really hurt their members.
So it's about having a seat at the table,
Mm-hmm.
not just being told what's going to happen, but being part of that conversation from the beginning.
Exactly. And unions can also keep an eye on how those transfer policies are being used, making sure that they're applied fairly to everyone across the board.
Okay, so that's a lot of power. It sounds like being part of a union in India can really provide some peace of mind,
Yeah.
when it comes to the possibility of being transferred. But what about employees who aren't in a union? What advice would you give to them?
That's a good question. And you're right. Not everyone has the benefit of being part of a union. For those employees, it's even more important to be proactive. They should really take the time to get to know their company's transfer policy inside and out, understand their rights, and don't be afraid to speak up if they have concerns. Talk to HR or even consider getting some legal advice if they think something's really unfair.
It's like that old saying, knowledge is power,
Yeah.
especially in a situation like this.
Yeah.
The more you know about your rights and how the company operates, the better prepared you'll be if you have to deal with a transfer.
Absolutely. And it's really important to remember that even in a system where employers have a lot of power, fairness and transparency are still essential. By understanding the legal framework, advocating for clear policies, and keeping those lines of communication open, we can create a system that's more balanced and equitable for everyone.
You've mentioned this legal framework a few times. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the key legal things that employers in India need to keep in mind when it comes to transfers?
Sure. There are a few landmark cases that have really shaped how transfers are handled in India. One of them is National Hydroelectric Power Corporation Limited versus Shri Bhagwan. In that case, the Supreme Court basically said that, look, transfers are just a part of the job in a lot of cases, especially when you're talking about government sectors, It's seen as a condition of service and something that's crucial for the public interest and efficient administration.
So right from the start, employers need to be clear about the fact that certain positions are transferable. No surprises down the line.
Exactly. Transparency is key. Another case that's often cited is S.K. Nasad Rahman versus Union of India. And that one really emphasizes the fact that the employer gets to decide where and when to transfer an employee based on what the organization needs. Employees can't just say, nope, I'm not moving. It's not a fundamental right to choose where you're posted.
So no, I refuse to move cards for employees to play. But that doesn't mean employers can just move people around on a whim, right? There have to be some limits to their power.
You're absolutely right. The courts have been very clear about that. While transfers are generally seen as the employer's prerogative, They can't be used as a punishment or based on some random reason. There has to be a legitimate justification for it. And the whole process needs to be fair and transparent.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are some practical things that employers can do to make sure those transfers are handled fairly?
hmm
We've talked about clear policies, but what else can they do?
Well, like we said before, having that well-written transfer policy and making sure it's applied consistently is really crucial. It should lay out things like the criteria for transfers, the process for actually making those decisions, and what options employees have if they want to appeal a transfer or raise any concerns.
And we also talked about this idea of equitable distribution as a goal. Can you break that down a little bit more for me? What does that actually mean in a practical sense?
So basically, it means making sure that you're not always sending the same people to the less desirable locations. While other people seem to always get the good assignments, the policy should try to spread out the burden and the benefits of transfers in a way that feels fair to everyone.
Okay, so it's about avoiding any appearance of favoritism or, on the flip side, the feeling that certain employees are being targeted.
hmm
But what about those situations where an employee has a really compelling personal reason to try and avoid a transfer,
Right.
like a family member with a serious health issue?
Yeah.
We touched on this before, but how much weight do those personal factors actually get?
This is where things can get a little tricky. The courts have generally said that while personal difficulties are definitely important and they should be considered, they don't automatically prevent an employer from transferring somebody. We talked about that case, Rajendra Roy versus Union of India. And in that case, the court basically said, look, it's up to the employer to consider those personal circumstances, not for the courts to step in and make that decision.
So it's more of an internal company decision. They can choose to be compassionate, but they're not legally obligated to put those personal circumstances above their own needs as a business.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. Employers need to be mindful of how these decisions impact their employees' lives, but they also have a responsibility to make sure that the organization as a whole can function effectively.
It's a tough spot to be in for sure. Wouldn't it be helpful if there was more open communication between the employer and the employee? Like if the employee really understands why this transfer is happening, maybe they'd be more understanding about it, even if it's not ideal for them personally.
You're absolutely right. Communication is key in these situations. Employers should be upfront about why the transfer is necessary, how long it's expected to last, what kind of support they can offer during that transition period. That can make a world of difference in how the employee feels about the whole situation.
Makes sense. Being left in the dark never helps anyone. So we've talked about a lot of practical things for employers to think about: clear policies, equitable distribution, open communication. But let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the bigger picture here. What are some of the ethical things that come into play when we're talking about employee transfers? Seems like there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong if they're not handled carefully.
You're right. There are definitely ethical implications to consider. We need to be thinking about things like fairness, respect for the individual, and the potential impact on families and communities.
That's a great point. It's not just about the legal stuff. It's about doing what's right even when it's tough.
Absolutely. And sometimes what's legally okay might not actually be the most ethical way to approach things.
Okay, so how do we make sure those ethical considerations are front and center when making decisions about employee transfers? What are some actual steps employers can take to make sure they're acting ethically?
That's a really important question and something that deserves a lot of thought. Maybe we can explore some of those concrete steps in our next segment.
All right, so we've talked about the legal side of things and all the practical stuff employers need to think about, and now we're getting into the ethical part of these employee transfers. It seems like there's a lot of room for companies to mess things up if they're not really careful.
Absolutely. When you're talking about moving people potentially across states or even countries, you have to think about the human side of it. It's not just about logistics and numbers. We're dealing with people's lives here.
Right, it's a big deal. So what can employers do to make sure they're handling these transfers ethically? Where do they even start?
Well, I think a good place to begin is by really trying to see things from the employee's perspective. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine being told you have to uproot your life, move your family, leave your friends and support network behind. It's a lot to handle.
Yeah, I can only imagine it's not just about finding a new apartment. It's finding new schools for your kids, new doctors.
Yeah.
It's basically starting your life over in a whole new place. It's a huge adjustment for anyone.
Exactly. So employers need to think about how they can minimize that disruption and make the transition as smooth as possible for their employees. Things like offering generous relocation packages, helping with finding housing and schools, giving people time to settle in before expecting them to be at their best. Those things can make a big difference.
It sounds like it's about going above and beyond just the bare minimum, you know, really showing employees that they're valued and that the company cares about their well-being.
Exactly. And it's not just about practical support. Either open and honest communication is so important. Employees need to understand why this transfer is happening, what the company's long-term plan is, how it all fits into the bigger picture.
That transparency can really help build trust, right? If employees feel like they're being kept in the loop and that their concerns are being heard, they're probably going to be a lot more open to the idea of a transfer, even if it's not their first choice.
For sure. And it's also important to be flexible and open to feedback. Maybe there are things the company hasn't thought of that could make things easier for the employee, or maybe there's a different solution that could work without requiring a transfer. It's about being willing to listen and adapt.
So it's about working together, finding a solution that works for everyone instead of just telling people what to do. It seems like that kind of collaborative approach can make a big difference in ensuring these decisions are made ethically and with everyone's best interests in mind. But what happens when things don't go smoothly? What if an employee feels like they've been treated unfairly or that their concerns have been ignored?
That's why it's crucial to have clear procedures in place for handling grievances. Employees need to know who they can talk to, how to raise their concerns, and what they can expect to happen as a result.
So it's about having a system that's fair and transparent where employees feel like they can speak up and know that their complaints will be taken seriously.
Exactly. And it's really important that those procedures are communicated clearly to everyone so they know what their rights are and how to use those channels if they need to.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The laws, the practical stuff, the ethical implications, and even what to do when things go wrong. It seems like employee transfers are a lot more complicated than they might appear at first glance.
Definitely, there's a lot more to it than just moving someone from one place to another. There are legal, ethical, and human aspects that all need to be considered.
So what's the takeaway here for our listeners? What's the most important thing for them to remember?
I think the key thing to keep in mind is that employee transfers aren't just about paperwork and procedures. They're decisions that have a real impact on people's lives, whether you're an employee facing a transfer, an employer making those decisions, or just someone who's interested in this topic. It's important to approach this issue with empathy, understanding, and a real commitment to fairness.
That's a great point. It's a good reminder that at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we need to treat each other with respect and dignity, even in the workplace. So as you navigate this complex world of employee transfers, remember to prioritize those values: fairness, transparency, open communication. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and informative.